All right, Joe, we'll say good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Shvat. To thank Bracha Strimber for dedicating all of the Shir and Drushos this month in memory of her husband Avi Strimber, Avraham ben Kallman Eliazer Halevi Zichron Levracha. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshama will have an Aliyah and the family a Nechama. We also thank Avi Tobias for dedicating all of the Shiurim this month in honor of the Daf, the beauty of the Daf, the beauty of the Shir. Baruch Hashem, we thank him very much for his dedication and generosity. And also with that, let us begin. We have a beautiful Daf ahead of us today. Today's Daf is Chaf Hey 25. We are picking up on Chaf Daled Beis 24b, and we left off. Let's actually pick up Amrli Rabbi Chiyah Rabbi Shimon Bar Rebbe, which is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16 lines up from the bottom. So Amrli Rabbi Chiyah Rabbi Shimon Bar Rebbe. Ilmali Atol Levi. So listen to this conversation. So Rabbi Chiyah said to Rabbi Shimon Bar Rebbe, if you were a Levi, Pasal Atal Min Aduchen, you would be unfit to go ahead and sing in the Beis HaMikdash. Why? Because your voice is very deep. So apparently he had a very deep voice, right, and a very non-melodious voice. So he tells him you would not be fit to sing in the Beis HaMikdash. So listen to this. Asa Amrei Lavua. Rabbi Shimon went and told his father Rebbe about what Rabbi Chiyah has said to him. Amrei, he said to him, Zil Eimalei, why don't you go back and say to Rabbi Chiyah, Kisha'ata magia eitzel v'chikisi laHashem lo nimtzeisa mecharef u'megadev. So I will say, interestingly enough, so Rabbi Chiyah was from a place that Halach Lamai said they often used to go ahead and pronounce their ches like a hey. They couldn't pronounce the cha, so they would often say ha. So Rebbe says back to his son, go to Rabbi Chiyah, when you get to the pasuk that says V'chikisi laHashem, which literally means I will wait for Hashem, if you have an inability to properly pronounce a ches and you pronounce it as a hey, you'll read that as V'chikisi laHashem, which chas v'shalom means to hit the Ribono Shel Olam. So essentially, Rebbe says to his son, go back to Rabbi Chiyah to mind his own business. Right? Everybody's got their thing. He's got his thing also. I'm Rav Huna. Zavalgon lo yisa eskapov. So we're going to see this theme, by the way, come up in the Gemara a couple of times. This yisod that, all kidding aside, everyone has their thing. Right? Everyone has their weakness. Whether it's your voice, whether it's the way you pronounce certain letters, everyone has their area of imperfection. It's the nature of people. So it's so important in life is to focus on improving your own area of imperfection and not to dwell on the imperfections of others. So the Gemara says, listen to this case. I'm Rav Huna. Zavalgon lo yises kapov. A Kohen, Rashi says, Zavalgon is Einav Zolfos Dima. This is someone ultimately, again, whose eyes perpetually tear. Someone has a tearing issue, right? They're constantly tearing. So the idea is such a person cannot go ahead and duchen. So the Gemara says, I remember, the idea behind this entire sugya are things which will be distracting in nature. There's nothing inherently wrong with a Kohen who has excessive tearing. That's not really a problem. But the idea is it serves as a distraction, and as we've seen from the Mishnah, anything that is distracting, we try not to have when the Kohanim duchen. So the Gemara says, but there was a Zavalgon, there was a guy with excessive tearing in the neighborhood of Rav Huna, and yet they still allowed him to duchen. Hahu dash bi'irahava. So both an interesting lashon. This was a person who everyone was used to. Look at Rashi. Dash bi'irahava. Kivar hayu regilin anshe iro v'lo hayu mistaklin ba'od. So also here's the difference. When people are accustomed to something, so they don't stare. So this individual, although he had this particular tearing issue, people were accustomed to it, right? And because they were accustomed to it, therefore again it was not a distraction. So the Gemara says, that supports this Zavalgon lo yises kapov, a person who goes ahead and tears, right? Excessive tearing should not duchen. But if everyone in the city was used to him, in other words, they knew who he was. He was a fixture in the city, so therefore it's no longer really a distraction. Ultimately, it's mutter. Amr Rabbi Yochanan, suma ba'achas me'inav lo yises kapov. A person who's blind in one eye should not duchen. Both say, same idea. there's nothing inherently wrong or disqualified about this person, but once again, it's a distraction issue. That's what this comes down to, a fundamental distraction issue. So the Gemara says, therefore, such a person shouldn't dochen. The Gemara says, but there was a guy, a Kohen, who was blind in one eye, and yet he dochened in the neighborhood of Rabbi Yochanan, to which the Gemara says once again, Hahu dash be'iro hava. This was a guy who everyone was used to. So also, we should begin to see, let's finish. So the Gemara says, that supports this. Suma ba'achas me'ina blo yises kapov. A person who is blind in one eye should not go ahead and duchin. B'maya dash be'iro mutter. But if he's someone ultimately, again, who was known, right, he was recognized in the community, then ultimately it's mutter. So therefore, I will say, this really becomes the theme, which is, we don't want a Kohen who possesses any distractions to duchen, because it just distracts people. But a distraction is only something that's novel, something that people are used to seeing. The halacha understood no longer serves as a distraction. So you have these things which quote unquote disqualify a Kohen for duchening, but if the people of his city know him and they're used to seeing him, then halacha l'maaseh is permitted to duchen, because the assumption is that his quote unquote issue does not serve as a distraction. Similarly, the Gemara says, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Mishaya Yadav Tzuvos Lo Yisa Kapov. So we saw in the Mishnah that Rabbi Yehuda said that halacha l'maaseh, someone who had dyed hands, let's say someone who works with dyes, and therefore his hands were stained, should not duchen. To which the Gemara says, Tana Imrov Anshe Ha'ir Malachton Bekach Mutter. We'll say if the majority of the people in the city are dyers, and therefore what? It's common for people to have stained hands, then it's not a distraction. It's the same theme. The concept of a distraction is only something that appears to be out of the norm. But either once it's common, so either if something's common, it's not a distraction, or if something is common in that people are always seeing it, it's not a distraction as well. Beautiful. We'll say let's go back. We're now going to come to some really, really beautiful and fascinating sugyas. Ha'omer, if a person says, Eini over the fnei teva b'tzvuin. Well, so let's say a person says, I'm going to daven for a person normally davens for the amid, but he says, you know what? I don't like to daven for the amid in colored clothing. That's his thing. I don't like to daven for the amid in colored clothing. Af b'levanim lo yavar. We don't let him daven for the amid even if he's wearing white clothing. What's the pshat over here? We'll see. We'll see all of this in the Gemara. But again, in a lot of these things, what we're nervous about is a person have some type of idolatrous hang-up. We'll see. So the Gemara says, "Any over." I'm sorry, lo yavar b'sandal. If a person says, "I will not daven for the amid in sandals," af and a sandal, af over af yachaf. We don't let him daven even barefoot. So the Gemara says, af yachaf lo yavar. Ha'oset tfilaso agula sakana. Ve'in b'mitzvah. If a person makes his tefillin round, his shalrosh round, so first of all it says sakana, it poses a danger, and not only that, there is no mitzvah, right? One does not fulfill the mitzvah of tefillin, because the halacha l'Moshe Sinai is that tefillin have to be square. So the Gemara goes weiter. Notzno al metzcho al pas yado. So also remember again, when the Torah describes the mitzvah of tefillin, it describes it as bein einecha, right? I should say al yadcha, on your hand, and bein einecha, between your eyes. If a person were to literally put the tefillin ultimately on the palm of their hand or on their forehead, in between their eyes, derech minos. This is the way ultimately again of being a min. I will say min, apikores. These are all terms often used synonymous. The Avi and Hilchos Tshuva describes them each as being separate categories. But the idea is, if Rashi says, a min is someone ultimately, again, who, according to this usage over here, who does not believe in Torah Shebal Peh. So this person goes ahead and literally disregards what Rashi calls Medrash Chachamim. V'holchin achrei mashmos ki mashmos beinenecha mamish v'yadcha mamish. Rabbi Silber say this min, this is a person ultimately, again, who rejects Torah Shebal Peh. If a person went ahead and covered his tefillin in gold, which sounds like a very beautiful idea, or he places it on his sleeve, this is the way of the outsiders. The Bible say, what does this mean? Derech achitzonim, outsiders. Rashi says, this is the way of people who follow their own logic of things and do not go ahead and rely on the das of the Chachamim. Good. So we'll say, let's analyze the Mishnah. Beautiful Mishnah. Says the Gemara, my timer. So we'll say, what's the problem? If a guy says, I don't want to daven for the Amid wearing colored clothing, we won't even let him daven wearing white clothing. What's the pshat? Chayshinon shema minos nizraka. We are concerned that ultimately, again, perhaps some apikarsus, right, has taken hold of him. Look at Rashi. Derech minos shema minos nizraka bo haminin ov de avodah zara makpidin bekach. We'll say, so sometimes you'll find that in Avodah Zarah, they're makbid about stuff like this, right? To only go ahead and wear white when going ahead and worshipping their particular deity. So when someone introduces things that are not part of our halacha, not part of our hashkafa, we are concerned that it's reflective, ultimately, again, of idolatrous ideologies. So the Gemara goes, so ultimately, again, if a person makes his tefillin, his shalrosh, round, so first of all, there's a sakana, there's an element of danger, and there is no mitzvah. Tefillin merubaos, halacha l'moshe min Sinai. It's an interesting idea in general. How do you know that tefillin are supposed to be square? The truth is, the Torah doesn't make any mention of it. So the Torah doesn't make any mention of tefillin being black, right? Or for that matter, again, the number of parashos, how the parashos are arranged. All of these things are halacha l'moshe min Sinai. Sinaitic law delivered from HaKadosh Baruch Hu to Moshe Rabbeinu. V'amarava b'tafran u'ba'alach sunan. Not only that, but how the tefillin are sewn. And the diagonal of the tefillin, also all of these details are all a halacha l'moshe min Sinai. Amar Papa masnisen da'avida ki amaguza. What are we talking about over here? In the Mishnah, we're talking about someone who made a shalrosh round like a nut. So ultimately, again, the idea over here is that a person who makes it like that, first of all, they're not in conformance with the halacha. Second of all, there was concern about sakana, because since tefillin is often put right by a soft spot in the skull, right? Ultimately, again, if it's round and there's impact, it can chas v'shalom go ahead and cause sakana for the individual. Beautiful. We'll say what you also begin to see from this Mishnah, which is really very interesting, is that Yiddishkeit, in general, Judaism, halacha, has the things that it's makbid on and has things that it's not makbid on. When we start introducing chumrus and hakpadas that are not part of our system, so by definition, what ends up happening? Harei derech minos. The Gemara says that's where is that coming from? It happens to be very interesting. Where the example the Mishnah gives in terms of if a person says, right, the person says, I'm only going to go ahead and daven in white, right? So in other words, when you introduce things, it looks very nice. I'm only davening in white, it looks very beautiful. That's fine. But when you introduce things and you try to institutionalize things that are not necessarily part of our Mesorah, not part of our Hashkafa, Chumras, that are not part of the way we live, so the Gemara says, Hariza derech minos. That's not Yiddishkeit. We've got enough on our theological plate, right? We have Baruch Hashem, beautiful Torah, voluminous Torah. So again, we don't need to bring in additional things in order to make things more complicated as a form of avodas Hashem. It's a very profound yisur in terms of, again, chumras have their place and additional stringencies have their place in order to preserve halacha, but how careful we have to be about institutionalizing chumras and taking things that are not necessarily part of the body of Yiddishkeit and making them like a 614th mitzvah. Something to think about. Says the Mishnah, Ha'omer, Vosei Tav of Chafei, Ha'omer Yivarchucha Tovim. Beautiful, such a profound Gemara. Someone who says, Yivarchucha Tovim, which means the good ones should bless you. Harei derech minos. This is the way of non-believers. What's the problem with that? Look at Rashi, Taf Rashi Chafei Medalef. Shena kolal harishon b'shvacho shal makom. Because ultimately, again, what you're saying is only good people have an obligation to praise HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now look at this beautiful Rashi. Rashi says, Shena kolal harishon b'shvacho, because again, so a person is excluding the wicked from the praise of God. And Rabbi said, look how beautiful this is. V'chachamim lamdu, quotes over the Gemara Mesechus Krisus, mechel b'na. So both say, remember again, you're saying ketores. So in ketores, one of the spices we have is chelbina. And Rashi says over here, sherechara. Chelbina is a putrid smelling spice. Umina hakasav bein samamani ketores, yet is counted amongst, right, is counted as part of the ingredients, the herbs of the ketoras. I will say the musar of chelbana being included in ketoras is what? You cannot have ketoras without putrid smell. You cannot have ketoras without rishoim. You can't have klal Yisrael without a cross-section of Am Yisrael. I will say we're going to talk about this tonight in the Chassidus Chabura a little bit. You know, it's an amazing thing that we forget that what Achdus means. Do you know what Achdus really requires? Achdus means tzaddikim and rishoim, right? Achdus means Shomrei Shabbos and Mechalolei Shabbos, right? Achdus means Ochlei Kashrus and Ochlei Tarfus. That's what Achdus is. You see, we often look at Achdus is, Achdus means I'm going to get along with my friends, right? And I'm going to get along with the people who are like me. That's not Achdus. Achdus means literally Rishoim also. It's everyone. It's everyone. Now, we'll say, to be clear, when we say Rishoim, so obviously there are some people who, through their actions, put themselves outside of Klal Yisrael. People who hurt other people, people who abuse other people. We're not talking about that. That's a different kind of rishos. Different kind of rishos. But Lamaisa, what you begin to see is something absolutely amazing. Even the person who's mamish putrid, right, in the way that he's living his life, he's not living according to Torah, not living according to mitzvahs. Such a person like that is part of the Ketoras as well. So this is incredible. So a person who says, Yivarchucha Tovim, which I don't know, sounds like such a nice praise, right? The good people should praise you. That is apikarsus. That's apikarsus. Because it's not just the good people who have a seat at the praise table of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's every single Jew, even the ones who are putrid in their actions, even the ones who are foul-smelling in their actions, have a place at the table as well. So beautiful. On the wings of birds. Right? Your compassion should come. For good things, your name should be remembered. Modim, or a person says modim. We'll discuss what that means. In all these cases, I will say, mishaskin also. If a person said any of these things, we silence them. Hamechana ba'arayas. What's very interesting? Mechana ba'arayas means someone who explains the laws of immorality as a metaphor. This is a person who says, the Torah is not really coming to tell you that certain immoral relationships are usher. Rather, it's a metaphor, right? The arayas are a metaphor for something else. So the Gemara says, mishaskin also. Ultimately, we silence him because it's not a metaphor. It's halacha. Ha'omer umizarachalo sitin lahavir lemolech. Person who interprets the pasuk that says from your offspring, you should not give to Molech. That will say, now remember again, Molech, Rashi points out over here, wasn't avodah zarah, right? Where again you'd have a path through two fires, right? And they would make children, it was a child sacrifice idolatry. They would make child walk through the path, and more often than not, the child was incinerated by the fires as he or she walked through. So a person who interprets that pasuk to mean, lo sitin la abra ba'armiyusa, a person interprets that to mean, don't have a child with a non-Jewish woman. That's what the Torah means. When it says, don't give your children over to Molech, it means, don't have a child with a non-Jewish woman. Because if you have a child with a non-Jewish woman, you're effectively giving that child over to Avodah Zarah. Now that statement is unequivocally true. Don't have a child with a non-Jewish woman. That's unequivocally true. Because one who does so ultimately is giving their child over to a different theology, of course. But that's not what the pasuk means. Right? The pasuk is saying, don't give your children over to Molech. Don't give your children over to Avodah Zarah. So Mishaskin also ben Azifa. We go ahead and we silence him, in a stark fashion. Nazifa sometimes can mean like a slap, and Nazifa sometimes can mean just like berating someone. The idea is that we give it to them. We give it to them. Now, both say, remember, it's not that what they're saying is wrong. It is true. You cannot go ahead and have a child with a non-Jewish woman. So it's not the issue of what they're saying is false. It's the issue of taking a pasuk and misinterpreting it. Look at Rashi. Rashi is Mishaskin so ben Azifa. Sha'okir akasav imashma'o shuhu avodas chok la'amoraim lahavir b'neim la'esh. The no saying kares lavo alakus. The idea over here is twofold. First of all, you're misinterpreting the pasuk. So, in other words, the statement is right, but the misinterpretation of the pasuk is what concerns us. Rashi also says over here, "V'nosin kares lavalakusis u'mechayiv chatas alashogim misas bezin al mezeh basra." Furthermore, the halach is that if a person gives over their child to chas v'shalom to Molech, there is a chiyuv kares. If you interpret the pasuk as a man having a child with a non-Jewish woman, you make that an offense punishable by kares. Now, I will say that's not true. You're not supposed to have a child with a non-Jewish woman, but if a Jewish man does so, it's not a chiyuv kares, right? It's not kares. So by misinterpreting the pasuk, you're also creating a legal falsehood. So there's a multiple problem. So the idea is mishaskel so benazifa. That's why, interesting enough, out of everything mentioned over here, this one gets the strongest response. Because not only is it a misinterpretation of the pasuk, but it also creates a legal falsehood, which can have very serious ramifications. So it says the Gemara, so I understand if a guy says modim modim, why we silence him? Because we'll say, what does modim modim look like? What does it look like? Dualism. It's like talking to two gods. Nami. So I understand also why we silence a person when he says, for the good, God, your name should be remembered. Why? Demashma al tov in va'al ra lo. Because we'll say, what does that make it sound like? That makes it sound like a Kadosh Baruch whose name should be remembered for good, but not for other things. Which makes it sound like the Ribono Shel Olam is only involved in the good things in life, and there's some other power that's involved in the negative. And Rabbi say, we know that one of our theological underpinnings is Utnan Chayiv Adam Lavarich Ala Ra Kashem Shemavarich Ala Tova. That a person is obligated to bless HaKadosh Baruch Hu for the things that we perceive as negative, in the same way that we are obligated to bless HaKadosh Baruch Hu for the good. Such an incredible yisod. So says the Gemara, and Rashi points out over here, on Tov we say Baruch HaTov HaMeitiv, and on Ra we say Baruch Dayan Emes. So therefore, when you say Yivarchu Chatovim, that ultimately, when you go ahead and you say Ala Tov Yizacher Shemecha, your name should be remembered for the good. That's acknowledging HaKadosh Baruch Hu's role in the good, but removing God's role in that which we perceive as bad. And that's theologically flawed. Says the Gemara, however, what's wrong with the phrase, on the wings of birds, right, your compassion should come? Which I will say is obviously a reference to what? To the mitzvah of kan sipor. And I'm saying, right, so again, I'm supposed to send away the mother bird before I take the eggs. That's the mitzvah of kan sipor. So I'm saying, right, on the wings of birds, your compassion should come. What's wrong with that statement? Because it's fascinating. So, pligi b'shem ma'arava. There was machlokes amarav in Eretz Yisrael. Rabbi Yossi bar Avram, Rabbi Yossi bar Zvida. Chadamar, one opinion said, mipnei shematil kina b'maiseh bereishis. So one opinion said, because you're creating animosity amongst creations. What does that mean about saying that halach l'maisa, you're creating a situation where a person, you're saying the Rebbeinu Shalom has compassion on the birds, but not on other things. So in other words, you're creating. So why does Kadosh Baruch Hu have compassion on the birds and not on the cows, or not on the sheep, or not on the fish? So you're creating animosity within the order of creation. Rashi says over here, Lomar ala ofos chas. So Chadam, the other opinion said, so we'll say very profound. The other opinion said no, because what you're doing is you are ascribing reasons to HaKadosh Baruch Hu's actions. So in other words, when you see Al Kansi Rachamecha, that presupposes what? That why do we send away the mother bird? Why? Out of compassion. How do you know it's because of compassion? I have a better idea. You know what? If you're so compassionate, what should you do? Don't eat eggs, right? Don't eat eggs. That's even more compassionate. In other words, by going ahead and saying, so also, and this is an incredible yisod in general, which is the need to go ahead and accept the fact that sometimes HaKadosh Baruch Hu's mitzvos, they're gzeros. There's nothing wrong with us trying to understand reasoning behind things, right? That's natural. HaKadosh Baruch Hu encourages that. But there's also a certain level where I accept the mitzvos of the Ribono Shel Olam as just that, mitzvos. HaKadosh Baruch Hu told me to do something, so I'm going to do something. Would I like to understand the reasons behind it? Of course. But at the end of the day, it's a gzeira. And I will say, sometimes it's hard for us to accept this, but I think that this is the cornerstone to successful Yiddishkeit. Because the moment that my observance and my fulfillment of mitzvos is predicated on understanding things, I'm going to run up against a really stiff theological wall. Because first of all, There are things I don't understand. That's Aleph. And there are mitzvahs that I'm not going to understand. And ultimately, the ways of HaKadosh Baruch Hu are not understandable. And that's why it's so important in the cultivation of our proper spiritual identities to recognize, on a most basic level, I am a soldier of the Ribono Shel Olam. And a soldier has one obligation, which is to listen to orders. And the truth is, the way an army works is at the end of the day, everybody follows orders. And we'll say, I just saw there was a news article. You remember this, the Marine captain who posted the video. What's his name? Scheller. Who posted, when they were pulling out of Afghanistan, pulling out of Bagram Air Force Base, and he went ahead and he posted this thing blasting everything. And it's very interesting because obviously, again, here was a man who dedicated his life, was willing to risk his life to go ahead and defend the country and defend the ideals. But there's a concept, and they had an interview with him yesterday. It was fascinating. He lost everything, right? Forget about his military position. His wife left him. His friends left. Like he lost everything. And it was fascinating. Why? Because in military culture, you're part of the team, and you do what you have to do. You have a problem. There's a way to deal with the problem, but it's not Facebook. Facebook is not the way to deal with anything, right? That's a different discussion, right? But Lamaisa, it's so fascinating. See, the man lost, again, very principled individual, it must be, but he mamish lost everything. And it's an incredible yisod, because what it means to be a Jew is I'm a soldier. Soldiers follow orders. That's what I do. That's what I do. And the army only works if everyone does what they're supposed to do. The Yiddishkeit works, the religion works when we do what we're supposed to do. There are going to be things I don't understand. Of course, that's the way life works. But that's when your commitment is truly tested. So a person says, who says it's Rachamim? Who says it's Rachamim? How do you know what it is? So let's listen to this. There was a guy who came before Rabbah. So Amar Ata Chastal Kansipor Ata Chusvrachim. So the guy is davening, and he comes up with this formulation. He says, Ribon Shalom. He's davening for the Amid, and he says, Kadosh Baruch Hu, you had compassion upon the bird's nest. You should have compassion upon us. Amar Rabbah Kama Yoda Haimi Rabbana L'Ratzuy L'Marei. Rabbah said, wow, beautiful. What a great shliach tzibur. Abai says, really? We learned in the Mishnah that Allah Lamaisa, someone says something like that, we silence him. The Rabba lechadude la'abai hu debayr. So we'll say Rabba was just testing Abai, right? He was testing him. In other words, you see this fellow throughout Gemara, that sometimes, again, people would say things that were clearly wrong in order to make sure that the other, right? The Talmidim were paying attention and to sharpen them. Beautiful. So also listen to this. There was a man who came before Rabbi Chanina who was davening for the Amid. Amr, Hakel, Hagodol, Hagibar, Vanora, Ha'adir, Va'chazak, Va'amitz. Shabbos say he decided Kel, Gadol, Gibar, right? There's not enough. We got to add in there Adir, Chazak, Amitz, which all means strong. Amrle, Saimetinhu, Lishvachei Dimarach. Rabbi Chanina says to the guy, are you done? Right? Are you done? That's it? You captured all of the praise? You got everything? So the Gemara says, Hani tlasa ilav de kasinu Moshe ba'oraisa vasu knes agdol v'takninu analo amrin alahu. So also Rabbi Chanina says something amazing. Had Moshe Rabbeinu not said, Kel, Gadol, Gibar, Nora, and Anshe Knesset Agdola codified it in Tefillah, we wouldn't have even said those. Va'at Amrit Kulihai, and now you're saying all of these praises, second one line of Osai. Listen to this. You ask yourself, understand, what's wrong with this? What's wrong? So a person wants to add on praises to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. What's the problem with that? So listen to this. Mashallah Adam Shahayu Lo Elef Alfei Alafim Dinari Zav. This is comparable, say, to a person who was fabulously wealthy, had all the gold. V'hayu mekalsin also be'elef dinari keser. Well, listen to this. Can you imagine? You go over to a rich person who has a lot of gold, and you say to him, wow, I heard you're so successful, you have so much silver. So the Gemara says, Ginaihulo, right? You're not praising him, right? By underestimating his wealth, you're actually slighting him. So the Gemara says, the truth is, we shouldn't praise HaKadosh Baruch Hu at all. Why shouldn't we praise him? Because any praise is going to fall short. It always falls short. Okay, so will you, Moshe Rabbeinu praised him, Anshe Knesset Hagdolah codified that praise. We'll use that. That's ultimately what we'll use. But we're not going to add on to that, because if you add on, one thing is absolutely unequivocally clear, which is, I'm going to fall short. So I'll say, which is so fascinating that sometimes if you can't articulate things properly, sometimes better not to say it at all, which is an incredible yesod in life in general. Right? So here, I can't properly articulate the praise of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so I'm going to go ahead and just leave it. I'll say what Moshe said, Ashkenaz Agdol said, but that's it. Arim Chanina, both say beautiful Gemara. Wow. Everything is in the hands of the Ribono Shel Olam except fear of heaven, which Abosai means. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we saw this in Messiah's Brachas. HaKadosh Baruch Hu controls everything, except for your ruchnius, for your spirituality. How holy you're going to become. The personal identity, that's what you're shemayim. The personal identity you're going to carve out for yourself, that's up to you. Tall or short, not up to you. Smart, not up to you. Wealthy, poor, not up to you. Good looking, average looking, not up to you. All of those things are predetermined by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I have to put in my ishtadlus, especially for things like wealth, for things like wisdom. But at the end of the day, the capacity for those things is determined by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The one thing in this world that I control is my spiritual identity. Who I am, that is the only thing I have complete shlita over. Shneimar, v'ato Yisrael, ma'ashem elokecha shalom imach, kiyim liyira. So the Gemara Moshe Rabbeinu says, and now Klal Yisrael, what does Hashem ask of you except to fear Him? So we'll say, what Moshe Rabbeinu is essentially in the Klal Yisrael is, look, Klal Yisrael, HaKadosh Baruch Hu does everything else. He's going to control all of the other factors in life. The only thing you control is if you fear Him. The only thing you control is your ruchnius. So the Gemara says, by the way, Michlal, the Yira Milsa Zutrasahi, and Moshe Rabbeinu makes it sound like Yira, fearing HaKadosh Baruch Hu, was such a small thing, like, all you have to do, the only thing I have to do, my whole life is a struggle to have a proper relationship with Hashem. My whole life is a struggle for ruchnius. Moshe Rabbeinu makes it sound like such a little thing, to which the Gemara gives an interesting answer in Legabe Moshe Milsa Zutrasahi. Yes, for Moshe Rabbeinu, this was a small thing. So we'll say, again, if we have time, we'll loop back to this. So all the Mefarshim ask, that's fine, but it doesn't answer the question. Moshe is not talking to Moshe. Moshe Rabbeinu is talking to us. But Lamais, again, so if we have time, we'll come back to this. There's so much on this piece. Rabbi Nachman has a magnificent piece on this as well. If we have a little bit of time here, Hashem will come back to it. But we'll say, but even without any further hesber, what a profound Gemara. We spend all of our time focusing on things that often we don't control. And we tend to neglect the one thing we do control. We get so upset over what other people do, how other people talk, how other people behave, right? And I have no control over other people. We get so upset over things that happen in our lives that often, again, we have no control over. And the one thing I do control, which is the person who I am, the identity I carve out, the persona that I create, that's the only thing I control in this world, all too often is neglected and relegated to a tier of secondary importance. This, Rabbi says, what Moshe Rabbeinu was saying, V'ato Yisrael, ma'ashem elokecha shalom imach. Your wealth, you put in your work, but that's up to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Your family, you put in your work, but that's up to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Fill in the blank. Everything. Put in the shtadlus, but it's to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The only thing for which you control the results and the outcome is the person you choose to become. Incredible. So the Gemara says, so we'll say with Moshe Rabbeinu, it could be compared to a person. Let's say I go over to a person and I want to borrow a large utensil. Say if he has it, if he has it, it's comparable to a small utensil. So katan ve'ein lo, but if a person ultimately again has, or if asking for a small utensil but he doesn't have it, it's like a large utensil. In other words, we'll say, when a person has something, he doesn't recognize the greatness of it. If he doesn't have it, he recognizes the greatness of it. So when Moshe Rabbeinu speaks at Yiras Shamayim, Moshe Rabbeinu possessed so much of it that ultimately, again, when he speaks about it to Klal Yisrael, it doesn't appear, quote unquote, to be such a big deal because he possessed so much of it. But sometimes if I possess little of it, unfortunately, then it becomes like a dramatic uphill battle. So beautiful. Homer Shma Shma. Both if a person says Shma Shma, Komer Modim Modim. Once again, the dualism issue. Mishasnoso. So the Gemara says, really? Meisfiakori eshma v'kofla. Listen to this. A person says Shema and then repeats it. Harei maguna. It's not a good thing. Now maguna means disgusting. Not a good thing. So the Gemara says, maguna hu dahavi shatuke lo mishaskina le. It's not good. It's not good. But Lamaisa, it doesn't sound like we silence him. To which the Gemara says, you're right. So the Gemara, lo kasha, hadamar milsa v'tanila, hadamar psuka v'tanila. Both say, listen to this. Everything depends on how you're saying Shema. If you go ahead and you say Shema, Shema, Hashem, Hashem, right? Shema, Yisrael, Yisrael, Hashem, Hashem. You repeat each word. So that's a meaningless statement, right? That doesn't mean anything, right? That doesn't have any significance. So something like that, that's maguna. So that's not nice. But again, ultimately, we're not going to silence anyone because what he's saying is nonsensical. Now, if you say Shema Yisrael Shalom Elokeinu Hashem Echad, Shema Yisrael Shalom Elokeinu, and you repeat it again, that's when the Mishnah says Mishaskenosol. Because what does it look like? It looks like Chas Hashem, you're talking to two gods. So that's when we get more concerned. This is great. Someone So listen to this. Rav Papa says, well, 1 second. Maybe when a guy is repeating the pasuk of Shema, what happened the first time? He didn't have kavanah. So why is he repeating it now again? Because he wants to have kavanah. Suppose they listen to this. So Rava says, Chavrusa klape Shmaya. What is God? Is God your chavrusa? Ilo mechavein daite. You know what? If you don't have kavanah, machinili ba'arzafta dinafcha ad mechavein daite. I'll hit him over the head with a blacksmith's hammer until he has kavanah. Okay, that works also. Right? So not really a contemporarily effective educational methodology, but you understand, right? So we'll say it's amazing. So what Rav is saying over here, Rav is incensed. What does this mean? Person says Shema without kavanah. Person says Shema. What? Kosh Baruch Hu is your chavrusa, right? Kosh Baruch Hu is your buddy that you could just talk to and repeat stuff. How do you talk to HaKadosh Baruch Hu without kavanah? How do you dialogue with the Ribono Shel Olam if you haven't prepared yourself for that dialogue? I will say, it's such a profound Gemara, such an incredibly profound Gemara. Rava can't fathom the idea that a person is going to talk to the Ribono Shel Olam without first mustering the requisite kavanah. And I will say it's something for us to kind of pay attention to. You know, there are different parts of davening. Not every part of davening is speaking to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The truth is, Birchos HaShachar and ultimately Psukei de Zimra is not talking to Hashem. It's really us talking to ourselves. It's articulating it's expressing gratitude and talking about the greatness of God. Speaking to HaKadosh Baruch Hu really begins at Shema. It really even begins at Shemona Esrei. Shema, once again, is a theological statement about HaKadosh Baruch Hu to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So Rabbah says, prepare yourself. Prepare yourself. Not every part is a dialogue with God, but the parts that aren't dialogical, I have to prepare myself to be ready for that dialogue with Kavanah. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not my chavrusa that I could talk to without meaning it. It's incredible musar. So the Gemara goes right. So somebody who explains the arayos, the laws of immorality in a metaphorical, euphemistic way, we silence him. Tan Rav Yosef, kolon ave v'kolonimo. But also going to be an example of explaining the arayos in a metaphorical way. The Torah says, "You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father." Right? Shabbos means you're not allowed to go and have relations with your father's wife, right? Or the nakedness of your mother. So the Gemara says, the person who explains that, what does that metaphorically mean? You shouldn't divulge disparaging things about your parents. That's what it means. It doesn't literally mean anything about any type of forbidden sexual encounters, but rather it means you shouldn't divulge secrets, right? So the Gemara, somebody who explains arayos like that, that's a misinterpretation of the phrase, of the pasuk, and therefore we silence them. This is a person, once again, who says that the prohibition of molech is explaining what we said in the Mishnah already, is referring to someone who says the pasuk doesn't mean giving your child to molech, it means having a child with a non-Jewish woman, because that is effectively giving your children over to avodah zarah. Again, we stop him because that is a misinterpretation of the pasuk. Mishnah, we'll say really fascinating sugya. Ma'aser Ruvain nikra v'lo metargem. The episode of Ruvain is read but not translated. Both say so. Again, remember, in the shul we have a Torgaman. The Torgaman's job is to explain the psukim away. We're now going to see there are certain things that we read but we don't translate. And the reason we don't translate them, both say, is because remember, as much as the Torgaman is going to do a good job translating, he's not getting into major mefarshim over here, right? We've got to move. So he's giving a very cursory translation. There are certain things which in order to go ahead and really understand them, require a more profound translation explanation. Because the Torah is not going to have time to do that, we essentially have him not explain things we have him unexplained. So the episode of Reuven is a good example of this. Remember again, the Torah says that Reuven slept with Bilhah. Now we know Reuven didn't sleep with Bilhah, his father's wife. What did he do? He moved his father's bed. But that's a whole Rashi. Therefore, the Gemara said, Mishnah says, Ma'aser Reuven nikra v'lo metargim. Ma'aser Tamar nikra u'metargim. The episode of Tamar, now we're going to see what this refers to. We'll see what it refers to. But we assume that the Ma'aser of Tamar is Tamar and Yehuda. Right? Tamar and Yehuda. So the story of Tamar and Yehuda ultimately again is read and explained. Ma'aser Egel Rishon nikra metargim. V'asheni nikra v'lo metargim. The first story of the golden calf is read and translated. The second one is read and not translated. I will say, the first one is when it happened. The second one is when Aaron told it over to Moshe. So we'll see the first time we read it and translate it, second time we just read it and we don't translate it. Berchas Kohanim, so Berchas Kohanim will say Yivrech Hashem, Maaseh David va'Amnon, the episode of David and Amnon, right? So we'll see exactly what this means in the Gemara. Nikran v'lo metargimin. These stories are read, but they are not translated. They're not translated. We don't use the Ma'aser Merkava. Remember, Ma'aser Merkava is the esoteric vision of Yecheskel. We do not use it as a Haftorah. For Rabbi Huda Mat, Rabbi Huda says you can. Rabbi Lezer Omer, Ein Maftir b'Hodas Yerushalayim. Rabbi Lezer says we also don't use as a Haftorah Hoda es Yerushalayim. Rabbi say that's also in Yecheskel. What's wrong with using Hodas Yerushalayim as Haftorah? So the rest of that pasuk is Hodas Yerushalayim es To'av Asal. The Navi talks about the abominations that were happening in Yerushalayim at the time of the Churban. So because it's disparaging to Yerushalayim, we don't go ahead and read it as a Haftorah. Says the Gemara Tan Rabbanan, Yesh Nikrin u'Metargim, Yesh Nikrin v'lo metargimin. There are certain things that we read and we translate, and certain things that we read and we don't translate. V'yesh lo nikrin v'lo metargimin. And then there are some things that we don't read at all, but tzibor, and we don't translate. So the Gemara says, Elu nikrin u'Metargimin. So Balat Akan Nashpa. Simon. Here we go. So my Sebereshis, so we'll say, watch this. The Gemara is now going to go through a more exhaustive list. My Sebereshis, the Genesis narrative. Nikra u'Metargim is read and translated. So Pshita. So the Gemara says that's obvious. In other words, why would you think that we don't read the Genesis narrative? I will say, watch this. Because we're concerned that we might have thought that we're concerned. Once you read the story of creation, people are going to ask, Mala Malo, Mala Mata. What is above? What is below? Amud Beis, Uma Lifnim, Uma La'achor. What's before and what's after? In other words, I will say, you might think that reading the Genesis narrative might go ahead and spark a whole bunch of conversations about, what was before Bereshis? What does it mean astonishingly empty? Did there was anything here before Hashem, after Hashem? In other words, it sparks a whole bunch of theological questions. That's what? That we can't really answer. Kamash Malon, no. Kamash Malon, both say, the Kamash Malon is we read my Bereshis, we go ahead and we explain it, and we know it'll spark questions. And you know what the Kamash Malon teaches me? It's okay to have theological questions that you cannot answer. It's okay. It's okay. That's part of what belief is. Belief is the ability to believe in something, even though you can't answer all of the questions. Incredible. The story of Lot and his two daughters is read and translated. Pshita, that's obvious. You might have thought you have to be makbid on the covenant of Avraham Avinu, is Avram's nephew, and he's sleeping with his two daughters. I might have thought that maybe we should just leave that story out. Kamash Malon, Kamash Malon, that we read it, and I will say we read it for a very important reason. Remember again, who comes from Lot? Right, is ultimately Rus, David HaMelech. Right, so I will say, so again, it's very important. One of the ways the Maharal of Prague writes, they will say, if you think about it, by the way, our monarchy comes from the strangest places, right? Our monarchy comes from the story of Lot and his two daughters on one side, and on the other side, it's Yehuda and Tamar. Right, so the Maharal says it's by design. It says in Gurari it's by design. Why? It's the best way to keep the monarchy humble. Because if the king ever gets a little too carried away with himself, you know what we say, king, hey king, let's learn a little, let's have a chavrus and sefer bereshis. Let's learn about the babas and the zaydas, right? Let's see how that, and I will say it's profound. it keeps the monarchy humble. Every other monarchy, the Maharal says, prides itself on its coat of arms and its pedigree and it's this and it's that. We also have an illustrious pedigree. But our monarchy, interesting, comes from these interesting stories to keep the king grounded. Incredible Yisod. Ma'aseh Tamar v'Yehuda nikra metargim. The story of Tamar and Yehuda is read and translated. So Pshita, that's obvious. What would you have thought? Lechosh lechvodo di Yehuda. I might have thought maybe we shouldn't translate it because maybe there's covet, right? Yehuda went to a harlot. Maybe out the covet to Yehuda, we shouldn't read it. Kamash malon shvachihu da'odu. No, because the story of Rabbi is the greatest praise to Yehuda. Why is it the greatest praise to Yehuda? Rabbi, why? Because he owned the situation. See, Rabbi say that people do things that are questionable or that look strange to us. That's human nature. But the godless of that story is that Yehuda could have said nothing, maintained his covet, his standing, and know what's it. But he owns it. And part of owning it, by the way, was admitting the fact that he went to a woman who he thought was a harlot, was fathering a child with this woman, right? Ultimately, he owned it. And that is the greatest shach, which is so incredible. The greatest praise that you could give a person in life, or the greatest accomplishment that a person could have, is own your circumstances. Own your decisions. So often when things don't go exactly how we want in life, we punt, we deflect, we blame. But the greatest praise is when you find the courage to own it. Incredible. So we'll say the first time, right, when you sit in the golden calf, we read and we translate. Pshita, that's obvious. What would you have thought? You might have thought that maybe we shouldn't translate the story of the golden calf because we should maintain the covet of Klal Yisrael. Kamash malon koshkin denechalu dahavilu kapara. To which the Gemara says no, because the embarrassment over the chet egel is part of the kapara, is part of the atonement. Klalos and brachos nikru metargamin. So it's very interesting. Klalos and brachos, curses and blessings contained in the Torah, are read and translated. And we'll say, get ready for this. So pshita, in other words, of course they are read and translated. Mautim, what would you have thought? Nechosh dilma paige dat tayu dit sibura. You might have thought that ultimately, again, this would have a negative effect, right, on the spirit of the congregation. Kamash malano. So what does that mean? So it's incredible. No, by the way, there are rewards and there are punishments. And if you do the right thing, you get the rewards. And if you do the wrong things, you get punishment. It's scary. Great, life is scary. Right? That's the way it works. There are consequences to all of our actions. We'll say, get ready for this. As haras va'onshin nikra metargamin. Right? So we'll say, ultimately, again, warnings, which are lavim, onshin, punishments, are read and translated. So the Gemara says, pshita, it's obvious. We'll say, get ready for this. Mountain, what would you have thought? Nechash dilma asu leme'aven miira. You might have thought that if you read and you translate lavim, prohibitions and punishments, then people are going to come to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu out of yira, out of fear, that they want to avoid the punishments and the lavim. So I would have thought, therefore, we shouldn't translate them. Kamash malon, no. Kamash shouldn't translate. And I will say, what does the Kamash malon teach us? What does that teach us? That an element of yira in our avodas Hashem is good. See, I was saying, it's true in every relationship, right? Why does a person remain committed to their marriage, right? And not seek fulfillment outside of the parameters of their marriage? Why? So part of it, hopefully, is because of an upstanding moral code. And the other part of it is what? Being scared of ramifications. Right? So I was saying, yira is a necessary ingredient in every relationship. So we like to say that, no, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Ava, all love and wonderful. Ava's great. And Ava should be the dominant feature of our relationship with the HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But there must always be a sprinkling of Yira, because Yira is what creates the knowledge of ramification. Let's say, think about this. Parents who spoil their children or never discipline their children. If there's no Yira in the way a person raises their child, that's it. It's done. If there's no discipline, if there's no fear of ramifications or repercussions, you can't expect your child to follow the rules. So I'm a child of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There has to be an element of yira in my avodas Hashem as well. So incredible. Ma'aseh Amnon v'Tamar nikra metagim. So also remember the story of Amnon and Tamar. Amnon and Tamar were children of David HaMelech. Amnon raped his half-sister Tamar. Right? That's the story of Amnon and Tamar. That story is read and translated. Ma'aseh Shom nikra pshita ma'odetema. Lechosh liyakre de David. You might have thought that maybe we shouldn't translate this story because This is what's happening with the children of David HaMelech. And maybe just out the covet of David. We just shouldn't translate this story. Kamash Malon we do. Kamash Malon we do. I will say, Maisa Pilegesh Begiva, Nikra Metargim. The story of Pilegesh Begiva Rabosei, which is where the story of, remember again, the man who was traveling through the tribal area of Binyamin, and his Pilegesh, his concubine, was raped by the men of Binyamin. A tragic and overwhelming story. That story is read and translated. Pshita. That's Avi Strimber, Lechosh Techvodo, the Binyamin, first end of the first wide line. You might have thought we shouldn't read it. It's covered to Binyamin. Kamash Malon, no. Kamash Malon, ultimately again, we read it. I suppose say, listen to this. The pasuk says, hold this, Yushalayim Estelvos, any Krimatar game. The pasuk of hold this, Yushalayim, ultimately again, let it be known the abominations of Yerushalayim. So says the Gemara, that is read and translated. Pshita, that's obvious. Lafuki mid Rabbi Eliezer. This comes to exclude the position of Rabbi Eliezer. Desanya, both say, watch this story. Incredible. Desanya, there was once a story of a man who was standing by Rabbi Eliezer. Literally, he was reading the psukim above Rabbi Eliezer. He was standing above Rabbi Eliezer, and he said, he was reading, Hodes Yushalayim Estov Osel. And he was reading out loud this pasuk, right? And let it be known in Yerushalayim all of its abominations. So Rabbi Eliezer hears this, get ready for this story. Amar lo, Ad Sha'ata Bodek Betovos Yerushalayim. Listen, buddy. Before you go ahead and you start speaking about the abominations of Yerushalayim, say ubadok b'tovas imecha. Why don't you go check out the abominations of your mother? Wow, good. I want to daven there. Right? That's an exciting place. Right? So as the Gemara says, badku acharab umatzav Hashem's pasal. Sure enough, they checked into the genealogy of this guy, and ultimately they found some disqualifying factor. So both say, this is really very interesting. The idea over here, did Rabbi, first of all, just a profound Gemara, because that's what we said before. Rabbi Eliezer was saying, before you go ahead and talk about the abominations of Yerushalayim, or the abominations or misdeeds of someone else, make sure your own affairs are in order. What's the expression? People who live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. So as Rabbi say, so often we're so quick to jump on the shortcomings or faults of another person, and yet we don't have our own affairs in order. So Eliezer says, before you go ahead and jump on the abominations of Yerushalayim, make sure the abominations of your own mishpacha are in order. So incredible. And again, even aside from Yerushalayim, again, we're so quick to jump on the shortcomings and faults. We see something we don't like, boom, we jump. Do we do that with our own shortcomings? Do we do that with are we so exacting? Are we as exacting with ourselves as we are with others? Or often when it comes to my own shortcomings, I'm willing to let them slide. When it comes to my own misdeeds, I'm willing to let them slide. But when someone else does something, then I'm a kanoi. Then I'm like Pinchas, spear in hand, ready to go. Can't live that way. It's a disingenuous way to approach life. First, take care of your own stuff, and once your own house is in order, then ultimately you have the right to go ahead and jump on the misdeeds of others. So the Gemara says the story of Ruvain is read and not translated. Who was listening to this? I don't know if this is actually like Kabul, right? But one time Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel went to Kabul, right? And what happens? Vayakori chazan hakneses vahi bishkon Yisrael. Listen to this. So we'll say this is the pasuk. It says, and right, vahi bishkon Yisrael. Va'amol l'meturgaman hefsek al tetargim ela acharon v'shibchu cham. So we'll say this is the pasuk that says, when Yisrael, Yaakov was living be'eretz Ahi, then it says, Vayelech Ruven vayishkav es Bila pilagesha. Ruven went and slept with Bila. Vayishma Yisrael heard Vayu b'nei Yaakov shnei masar. So Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel is in Kabul, and he hears the Baal Korei say to the Turgaman, essentially, translate the beginning of the pasuk, the end of the pasuk, but not the middle of the pasuk. So the Gemara says, V'shibchu chachamim, and they gave him mishkayach. They thought the Baal Korei was doing the right thing. The Gemara says, "Ma'aseh egel hasheni nikra v'lo matargim." So remember again, this first story of the egel is read and translated. The second one is not. Ezu ma'aseh egel hasheni. What's the second story? Vayomer Moshe ad vayar Moshe. So let's say, so again, it's the retelling of Aaron. Time Shon Elazar Omer li olam yehi adam zar b'tshuvosav. Shemitoch tshuva she'yeshivu Aaron l'Moshe parka ma'orim shneimar v'ashtichil ba'esh vayitz egel hazar. Both listen to this. With this, we'll stop. There are two reasons why we don't translate the second story of the Egel. Remember again, the first story is when it actually occurred. The second story is when Aaron tells it over to Moshe. we don't translate the second story. Why not? Number one, because it's not necessary. We don't have to say the story of the sin of the golden calf again. We just translated it the first time. The second time, says the Gemara, is because Aaron says to Moshe, I threw the gold into the fire, and this egel came out. I will say, what does it sound like when you say this egel came out? What does it sound like? Sounds like the egel had a life of its own, that it really was a deity. Says the Gemara, that's another reason we don't translate this phrase, or this section, because the way Aaron spoke is it sounds like he's ascribing power to the golden calf. And therefore the Gemara says, just in general, be careful what you say. Because sometimes a slip of the tongue, or sometimes not being imprecise with your words, could allow people to walk away with flawed ideas and theology. We know this all the time. This is Chachamim Hizaru b'divreichem. Be wise and be precise with your words. Because if you're not precise, ultimately, again, you could lead people to walk away with erroneous perceptions. So we'll stop over here today. Incredible Gemara, incredible Gemara. Meretz Hashem will continue with it tomorrow. Shkayach, everyone.